To have you here at the museum. My name is Aisha Khan. I am the CEO at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And it is always an honor to be asked to welcome folks to this space. We are here this morning, or I guess it's now afternoon. Beautiful weather, actually. I thought it was going to be terrible. So it's a beautiful sunny afternoon here in the Garden of Contemplation at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. I'm going to come back to the importance of this particular day here. All the things that are here on traditional land. These are the traditional ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, the Ininawa, Anishinaabe, the Dakota Oyate, and the Nisugane. And we are, of course, in the homeland of the Red. Also want to acknowledge that in the ponds around us, and water fountains that in PM and in Winnipeg as a whole, we source our water from the lake. And just give gratitude to the people, the three First Nations that border Shoal Lake 40, Shoal Lake 39, Independent, Iskatisiwazak, First Nation, and Northwest Anglo. And those First Nations have their time immemorial cared for that water so that it can nourish us here in Winnipeg. So I start with that land acknowledgement, not just because it's a great way to start and ground us in a gathering, but also to give reflection to the people who gathered for thousands of years on these lands, enrich trade and culture, bringing together spirituality and relationship, and reflecting a little bit about this particular gathering that we're having here today. The book that we're going to hear from, who we're here to celebrate today, is one that talks about culture and identity, about new ways of thinking and being and doing for all of us. And I know that the first peoples of these lands called on us to do exactly that, to understand their ways of being and doing. And so it was a really beautiful connection for me to think about what that means when we have this book launch here today. I'm so pleased to be able to be part of events like this that are about storytelling. And it goes without saying that Dr. Abdulrehman is a storyteller, not only a professional, but a storyteller that it has this unique gift of being able to weave together the things that we think about deep in our hearts and the things that we do. And I know that we will reflect today. As I thought about Jinn in the family, first of all, I thought, my gosh, there was a Jinn in my basement growing up. I knew it. And I still wear a ring with a prayer that's supposed to protect me from those Jinns that are the scary ones. But the more that I've heard Dr. Abdulrehman talk about Jinn, talk about the concept and why it matters to us to understand different ways of knowing, different spiritual beings in and amongst us, opens us up to different ways of understanding culture, and mostly identity. So as a museum for human rights, in a world where we think about the rights often that we are born with, that inherent right to dignity, to be valued for who we are, and to not be treated differently because of who we are, it is an honor to be here to think about identity and culture and all the ways in which we're called in to do that work. I won't take up much more of your time other than to say this book is pretty amazing. I think the way that you captured the way we ought to think with storytelling, folklore, or culture is something that calls us in to reflect on who we are as human beings. And I cannot start any gathering without a moment of reflection of the atrocities that go on in the world around us, and the folks that are attached to their land that cannot experience and practice their culture and faith and religion in the ways that they want to, or who lack basic access to food and water, culture and tradition. And so what a privilege it is to be in a room where we can go deep into understanding identity and culture and folklore, a place that may be mystical or far away for us, or may actually just validate the stories that we've been told our whole lives. With that, I'd like to turn it over to told him I was a fan. Terry MacLeod is going to be interviewed today. Long, well-known broadcaster, journalist, just a huge following in this city. So what a gift to have Terry be the interviewer this morning. Dr. Abdulrehman, who is the star of the show, who doesn't need an introduction, and is going to fill us up with his beautiful voice and words of things that we're going to talk about. And just thank you all for being here. And most importantly, thank you for choosing to have this gathering here in this museum. It is not lost on us that there is symbolism behind the words in the book that draw us to be in this place, in this gathering today. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. This book has actually been probably the most personal book for me. It was a way to set the record straight. A few years ago, I gave a TEDx talk called "Resolving Unconscious Bias," with the question, "But where are you really from?" And it generally, as a Canadian, as somebody who's lived here and grown up here, to be a person of color and to be asked that question repeatedly, but not having white people ask that question, that question kind of is one that becomes an offensive question. But ironically, in this book, I actually answer that question, where I get to talk about our family's ancestry and the folklore, and it is largely fiction, but it's based on real events and real people mixed together with some really interesting storytelling. But it does also tell the story of a people that had some difficulty surviving. Our family survived the Zanzibar revolution, and it's such a small part of the world. And if you ask anybody if they know about the Zanzibar revolution, most people wouldn't know anything about it. I mean, even myself growing up, I didn't know. It wasn't something that I learned about. It wasn't something that parents talked about right away. And so there's this little hidden piece of history in the world that nobody gets to talk about. And as we watch about what's happening in the world today, as we watch about what's happening in Palestine, it occurred to me that it's a good idea that I put some of this in writing, even if it's through fiction, so I can set the record straight about our family, in some ways, our community, and our people. Mm-hmm. And I thank Terry MacLeod for being here with me. It's a real honor to have you do this interview.
And for me too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. As I look out into those of you who are here, I want to say Assalamu alaikum, because I have so many Muslim friends from my history of life and work in Winnipeg with the Muslim Leadership Institute and such. And so I wanted to just thank you and feel that you are welcome here and that this book will be especially meaningful to you. But Raymond, if we could begin, what is a Jinn?
So, in most of the Western world, people would refer to spirits as ghosts. In the Islamic world, we don't actually believe that the dead can come back as a spirit. Once you're dead, you're dead. But we do believe in spirits, and we believe that prior to the creation of man, Islamic culture and religion and folklore believe that there were creatures and beings called the Jinn. And we think about the elements of creation. So the Jinn were created out of a smokeless fire. The angels were created out of a white light. And human beings and animals, which we now know as carbon-based life forms, were made out of earth. And so the Jinn are those beings. And Muslims believe that the devil was not the first Jinn, but was a Jinn. And he wasn't a fallen angel, but was initially a revered being in heaven. And when he had a sense of pride, when human beings were created, God asked everybody in heaven to bow to this creation. And there was a sin of pride for him. He said, how am I, one who's made out of fire, was going to bow to somebody who's made out of dirt? And so the Jinn are a species, according to Islamic faith and culture, that are made out of, they live on a parallel plane, but they're made out of fire, a smokeless fire.
What inspired you to write this book?
So the book has actually been sitting around probably since I was around 21. I remember actually running it by Dennis Cooley. I took a course with him, and he'd been a mentor in writing for some time. And so I'd wanted to kind of write about people and the family, like all these figures. But as time goes, like by the time I went back to write this last year, like so much changes when you get older that I ended up rewriting everything. And it became a very personal story in some way, right? It became a story about, coming to terms with identity. And the Jinn were no longer just a literal concept of a being. They were a metaphor. They're a metaphor for identity and culture, and how many people of color hide elements of their identity, and how many people of color and people who come from non-Western, non-white cultures have to treat their culture and their identity like it's a ghost, like it haunts us. How much of it do we let out? How much do we share with people? Will people think that we're non-Western? Will people think we're crazy by talking about this? And will people think we're not scientific? And then further to that, I think the Jinn also reflect a sense of trauma. And I think anybody who's, regardless of culture, who's experienced difficulty, anybody who's experienced trauma will know that after that trauma, we become a ghost of ourselves. And we literally haunt the earth looking for some sense of resolution, right? Trying to make sense of what we went through. Why did somebody do that to us? And we're looking for affirmation in many ways that ghosts and spirits do. And so there was that important metaphor for me to pull in as well.
What does it mean to have, as the title of the book puts it, a Jinn in the family?
So in Zanzibari culture, the Jinn aren't, it's interesting. So in Western concept, we tend to think about good versus evil, and the Jinn being demons, are bad. But in Zanzibar, and in many Muslim cultures, and Islamic culture, the Jinn aren't necessarily all bad. They're like human beings. They have different faiths, they have different cultures, they are different parts of the world. And in Zanzibar, it's known that almost every family has a Jinn. And, and because they come in different forms, the story was that some people kept Jinn as pets, and other people were drawn, they drew the Jinn to them. And the question was, why was that the case? In Islamic culture, Islamic folklore, even many Muslims don't know this. There's words that we use to describe this sixth sense. And in the West, we refer to it as singular sixth sense. In the Quran, it actually says, over hellfire, there are 19 angels, each one representing a sense of the human being. And there's 19 chapters in the book, right? So it's important to recognize, I think, this idea that each of us as family members may not just have a literal Jinn, but we carry with us some level of trauma that need to be resolved.
When you and I were talking the other day, you told me that the Quran references Jinn.
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in the Quran. It's called Surat al-Jinn. And so for Muslims, it's very important that we believe in the unseen. That's an actually essential element of faith, is to believe in the unseen. And that refers to the Jinn, angels, and God.
And how does that acknowledgement govern your behavior, our behavior?
There's a whole sense of courtesy of how we must engage with the world, being mindful about the supernatural and the unseen. And I think many people would take this as a form of superstition, but for Muslims, we're thoughtful. Anytime we enter a place that we believe that a Jinn might exist, we're taught to say certain things that protect us, to wear certain rings, that we are thoughtful and mindful about how we engage with the world.
Okay, now you've got me looking at the rings on your hand.
Oh yeah, these rings are. This one says Abu Yusuf, which is
your son,
which is my son. Well, Yusuf is my son, Abu Yusuf. So in our culture, when somebody has a child, their name informally changes to father or mother of the eldest child, and so that's that. And this is just a family crest.
And your father is here this afternoon.
Yes, yeah, Yusuf Senior. Yeah.
Why does Zanzibar, though, play such a huge role in your life and in this book?
Well, actually, interestingly enough, I think Zanzibar has played an interesting role in more than one of my books. I mean, as I said, when we immigrated to Winnipeg, and to me, I've always been Canadian. As much as I've got this Zanzibari history, but to be called out on identity repeatedly, it's like, well, where are you from? Zanzibar. Okay. Where's that from? Africa. Well, you're not black, right? It's like, okay, now I have to explain our history and our identity to people. It's like, well, okay, well, where's your family from? Are they from Egypt originally? Are they from India originally? Where exactly? It's like you play this game of identity. And so Zanzibar, and I'd say my identity has been critical to my understanding of the concept of race, ethnicity, and culture, and having that lived experience of having a mixed heritage, of coming from a place where it doesn't fit a box for people. And I use that in my other book, Developing Anti-Racist Cultural Competence, and we know now anthropologists the American Anthropological Association has tossed aside the word race because it's an artificial racist construct that came from the West. And for the rest of us, many parts of the world, we don't belong to one particular race. We belong to a human race, but it's our ethnicity and our culture that defines us. And I think a lot of the saying of Prophet Muhammad, who said, if you want to be an Arab, learn Arabic. And I thought that's fascinating because identity, what he was referring to, wasn't tied to bloodlines. And at that time, there was a lot of racism in Arabia. And what he referred to is to have a sense of belonging was to have a common culture. And that's the thing that I pull from all this. So what do we share as a culture?
But you talk in the book about Swahili and what an important role it played in the lives of people in Zanzibar. Why?
Well, Zanzibar language had a lot to do with it. Swahili itself is actually Swahili is in and of itself a mixture of a very ancient indigenous language and Arabic. You see, Arabs actually first came in a non-colonial way to Zanzibar, 2 generations after the Prophet Muhammad. That's like more than 1,200 years ago. And there's this little mosque in Zanzibar, and it's still there. This is the first mosque that is about.
Yeah, I've seen the photos of it.
Yeah, about 1,200 years old, right? That's sitting close to a beach. You can think about people when they arrived and they set up, and there was this sense of harmony. Colonialism did enter into the picture, but initially it was this mixing of cultures, and Swahili itself is a mixture of those 2 languages.
And so the languages spoken in Zanzibar are Swahili, Arabic, and a couple of others, right?
Yeah, well, Zanzibar was a trading port, and so there's numerous languages that come into play, and like our dialect of what we speak is really a mixture. And different communities in Zanzibar will have different dialects which have different mixtures of different things. The original official language of Zanzibar was both Swahili and Arabic. But depending on the cultural lineage of the families and the communities, you have a mixture. So, there is Swahili, there's Arabic, there's Kutch, there's Portuguese, right? And you have all of that. There are words in our language now that I remember I had Portuguese patients and they're on the phone talking Portuguese, and I'm like, wait, I know those words. It's like, what did you say? And I was like, I said pão. You're talking about bread? Yeah, talking about bread. It's like, how did you know that? So.
Okay, bread, food, cooking are such central features of this book. You could extract an entire book of recipes from this book all alone, because there are so many great descriptions of food made with chopped dates, pistachios, hazelnuts, walnuts, flavored rosewater, mastic gum, bergamot, orange and lemon juice, nougat, dried apricot, and dried coconut, to name just a few. What's that about?
So our family's known as confectioners. There's a character in this book who was actually my great-grandfather. His name was Haji Omar. And so actually there was multiple cooks and chefs and confectioners in our family history, but he was the one that was most well known. And he made this halwa, or lahum in Turkish, or Turkish delight as people might know, that became known all across the Swahili coast and into Arabia. And to this day, it's known. And so a lot of the other sweets that he made have disappeared, but this one confectionery still exists. And so people joke that both diabetes and confectionery is in our family book.
I have to tell you that I had to read the book with Wikipedia open fully so that I could explore the concepts and the words and the foods and the language that I had never heard anywhere else. What was your thinking about including that kind of language in the book?
I didn't want to write having to explain myself or justify, right? And I think about good literature or even a good TV show. They're often the ones that just drop you in the middle of a place, and now you've got to figure stuff out, right? And I didn't want to, and that's exactly what I wanted for this book. And I wanted, it's not a massive book. I tend to write.
You know, it's massive conceptually.
Thank you.
Massive in terms of language. Massive, well, in terms of recipes. And let's cook together sometime so I can explore some of those things.
Yeah, I think that I didn't want to have to justify myself. And I was like, how do I write this in a way that people would still get a lot, but then there would be things that they want to learn. And I think that's how we need to approach people and cultures, that, you know, we need a common footing, and we have that, and the book is written with a common footing. But ultimately, you want people to kind of be invested in not just the book, but the stories that we tell each other.
You didn't include any reference to the Great Canadian Baking Show, for which you could have been you were a candidate, but your life was too complicated to get to participate in the baking show.
Yeah, I was accepted onto the Great Canadian Baking Show a couple of years ago, and I made it all the way. I did all the stuff. I made everything that I was supposed to compete with, and like literally 2 days before, I had to bail. So yeah, it was a missed experience, but I got to live the chaos of turning my kitchen into a giant mess for a couple of months.
It must have smelled amazing, and I mentioned that specifically because the book is so much about scents.
Yeah.
And about the way that you roll scents into your understanding of your community, the larger community, and why scent matters so much. Why is that?
Well, it might be because I'm pretty deaf most of the time. And I think my sense of smell has probably, you know, I had problems with eyesight, and my hearing is okay, but it's not always the best. But scent for me has always been critical. I could smell a fart a block away, you know.
Isn't that handy? Yeah.
So it's sometimes not helpful. But
I think your mother is laughing right now.
She knows because I pick it out whenever somebody in the family has.
But that's not an appearance of a Jinn, though.
No. Although it is a haunting of some sort. Yeah. But I also think it's a different way. It was important for me to find a way to relay. You know, how do you relay taste and flavor? And how do you relay such a critical component of human experience, which I think scent and taste really is? And how do you put it into literary terms? And that was a bit of an experiment for me. It was like, how do I do this in a way that people want to eat the food, can smell it in a way?
Now, I was talking with your dad a little bit about living in Stone Town on Zanzibar. And what's so significant about Stone Town?
I mean, a lot of things. It is very much like a living museum. So some of the book is actually based on my going back there, because I didn't go back. So there was like the revolution.
Which was what year?
1964.
Okay, and that was a revolution that involved?
So the Zanzibar was under the rule of the Sultan of Oman.
Of Oman. Mm-hmm.
So it was considered the jewel, and it, as a result of the trading port and slave trade, had brought a lot of people there. But the people actually, you know, mixed. I mean, the slave trade there was a little bit different.
How so?
And not that it was good. You know, slavery was bad, but it was not tied to racial lines. It was tied to domination. And so, like, if somebody took over a place, then they'd have slaves. But people would marry and intermarry, and so quite often, the slaves would quickly become the sultanas. They'd become the queens. So the sultan would marry their slaves they fell in love with, and they'd marry them, and then there was movement. And so if you take a look at the sultans who were first there in Zanzibar, they looked very Omani. They looked very much like myself and my family might look. But then over time, you take a look at the last sultans, and they looked very black, is how most people would perceive them, right? And so, but they would call themselves Arab, because again, it was their culture. It wasn't tied to ethnicity. But Zanzibar still had a uniqueness to it, and I'd say, despite all the horrible things that occurred there, that it had a really interesting mingled sense of people and culture. I mean, it's not uncommon that people and family will have, they'll have kids, and then surprise, you look like this, and surprise, you look like that, and it was simply because we have so much mixed blood in our lineage, and I play on that in the book,
Yes.
the concept of that mixed lineage.
Yeah. Now, as a Muslim psychologist, what can I ask this? I'm not sure it's appropriate. What are the unique characteristics of Muslim and Zanzibari mental illness?
Well, I would say it's not just in Zanzibar, it's many parts of the Eastern world, including many Muslim cultures and countries. There are times, I think, things that couldn't be understood a long time ago were labeled as a form of possession. Right, so it's not uncommon that people who have very severe mental illness, like schizophrenia, would be falsely labeled as being possessed. But there was also a really unique thing that happens in these cultures, that there are things that happen that we can't quite explain. And frankly, they could happen here too. I mean, I've seen patients from indigenous cultures and other cultures, and they'll describe things that happen, and I'm like, that doesn't meet the criteria for schizophrenia or psychosis. And there were times that I remember this one story. I was in Zanzibar, and I come back to the mainland, and apparently this family was looking for me, and they wanted me to meet with their son. It was like 10 p.m. at night, and they'd knocked on the door of where I was staying, and they said, "Could you please see our son?" And it was like 10 p.m. at night on a Saturday, and you don't say no in our culture. It's just like they came looking, and so anyhow, I met with them, and mom really and the boy did meet criteria. He had schizophrenia. It was very clear. But mom really wanted him to be possessed. And the reason being is...
Possessed by a jinn?
By a jinn.
Okay.
Because for her, that was more treatable. Like they'd already done their rounds. They were at the hospital. He'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia. I just confirmed what the doctors had already said. But for her, it was more painful to accept schizophrenia because it was a longer term illness that he'd have to sit with, and but with being possessed, she wanted to clarify, because then he could go to a traditional healer, and tomorrow could be better, and so there is that. And then there's stories, and one shows up in this book. Like, I remember working with some colleagues at and there's like an inpatient unit, and so I'm like, so have you guys ever seen anything unexplainable? And one of them was my students, and he looked at me, and he looked at the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist and him looked at each other, and like they had something to say, but they didn't want to share it in front of me. And my student goes, "You can tell him, he's from here, right? Like, his family's here, so he's not going to judge you." So he's like, "Okay, let's tell you this." And she's like, "Well, last week we had this woman come in to the clinic and saying she wanted to be hospitalized. And we asked her, 'Why do you want to be hospitalized?' And she's like, 'Because I have pins coming out of my arms.' And so they said what she would do is she would press her forearm, and these long needles would come out of her arm, and press, and these long needles would come out of her arm. And we saw this, and there's like not a drop of blood, just these needles coming out of her forearm. And she thought she was losing her mind. She thought she was having a hallucination. And I said, "Well, what did you do?" We told her to go home. She wasn't crazy, And so, what do you do with a story like that? And these are legitimate professionals, people who are concerned about their reputation, didn't want to come across as unscientific. There was a Western trained psychologist that like, do we share this with him? What is he going to think of us? So, I think there are times, at least that I've seen, I've had other very interesting experiences that certainly challenge what we think we know, because there's times you can clearly say, yep, that is mental illness. And then there's times you're like, I have no idea where to place that. And the character in the book struggles with that. What do I do with this experience?
If you call, or should I ask, do you call the manifestation of a jinn a form of mental illness?
Not Islamically. Most people don't know this, actually, that Islam has a lot of neuroscience built into the Quranic text. There's verses that actually 1400 years ago talk about the most common mental illness being depression and anxiety. We're figuring that out.
In the Quran?
In the Quran. There's literature in there. The stuff in the Quran actually talks about neuroanatomy of the brain, the whole concept of creation, the differences between brains, between animals and human beings, and what, the concept of how that's tied to free will. And most people don't know this, so for Muslims, most people know that we pray, we'll put our forehead on the ground. And so in the Quran talks about it as the forelock. And we were, according to our story of creation, we place that part, because this is the part that, the frontal cortex is the part that's ultimately free will. That's our decision making. It's the part that makes us human, right? The difference between animals and human beings is that our frontal cortex is far larger, and animals have a far smaller one. And so when Muslims pray, and Islam means not just peace, it means submission to God. And Muslims are one who submit. And so when we pray, we submit our free will to God. And so there's all of this really beautiful neuroanatomy and psychology kind of built into the Quran. And we talk about mental illness in there. And most people don't know the treatment for OCD, that's CBT, actually was initially developed by an old Islamic scholar.
So CBT is cognitive behavior therapy.
Behavior therapy.
Yeah, I've had it. Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's good therapy.
Yeah, I found it exceedingly helpful, actually.
Yeah.
Speaking about psychology and psychologists, Carl Jung turns up in the book.
Yeah.
And he was, the people that we all, the person we always associate with Freud in a certain way. Why did you make mention of Carl Jung?
So I had lunch with an old professor and mentor and now friend of mine, Dr. Marianne Johnson, on Friday, and she was very into Carl Jung, and I learned a lot about. And she was reading the book, and she's like, "There's a lot of like Jungian psychology in this book," and I was like, "Yes, there is." But more specifically, there's this concept of the shadow self that shows up in this book, and this idea that all of us struggle with a shadow self. And Jung talked about, that once we learn to embrace our shadow, that we get to truly become who we are. And so I think many of us struggle with, and I talk about identity, many of us struggle with this concept of, the duality of who we are as people. The entire first chapter of this book talks about that. And this idea of coming to terms with our shadow self, whether it's reflected metaphorically with the jinn or not. Now,
Moving on to pop culture now. For those who don't know it, the giant pop singer Freddie Mercury of Queen was from Zanzibar.
Yes, he was.
Right? Yeah? Now, one of the characters in the book, Popobawa, they knew Freddie Mercury's family? Now, is that fiction or is that?
That's fiction, yeah.
Oh, drat.
Although I think our parents know the family. They're like, oh yeah, they live down the road. So they're familiar with the family, yes.
Yeah. And do they know how he became such a gifted performer?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Well, they're smiling there.
Yeah, maybe they know.
Okay.
I don't know.
What is the political status of Zanzibar now?
So Zanzibar is a semi-autonomous region of Tanzania. So it used to be that the mainland was Tanganyika and the islands were Zanzibar. And Zanzibar was ruled by Oman. And then there was a revolution. And following the revolution, there was a coming together of the two countries. Tanganyika taking 10, Zan from Zanzibar, and it's now Tanzania.
Mm-hmm. What have I not asked you that I should have?
It's a good question. Maybe I hope people pay attention to the layers in the book. Like I don't know if when I was writing this, I hope I'm doing a good job of it. I'm not sure, but people are getting them, which is good. Like I've left Easter eggs behind in the book.
Oh yeah, you and Taylor Swift.
Oh, don't compare me with Taylor Swift. Terry. Yeah, I put in little pieces, and some of them are going to be noticeable to everybody. Some of them to people who've experienced trauma. And then there's some that are cultural, and I hope that if people pick away at them, they're like, oh. And then for those of us who already are familiar with the culture and words and language, including the meaning of the names, like I encourage people to Google the meanings of the names. Like there's these layers, right?
Yeah,
so
and I was doing that, yeah.
Yeah. And so there's the story, and then there's the names, and then there's some metaphors that get pulled in. So, and there are some direct and some not so direct. I put good reference to one of my father's favorite songs growing up. Actually, he used to listen to Kulthum, very famous Egyptian singer, and it was interesting how life comes around because he used to love this song, and so I made sure that it was in the book. And then my son, Yusuf Jr., got into a show called Moon Knight. And one of the songs he liked the most was actually a remix of this song, 1001 Nights by Kulthum. So it's got to show up in there. Yeah. So, and then there's the illustrations that have a nod here and there. So I encourage people to look at the different levels, and even the titles of the chapters kind of tell a story on their own. So if you read the chapter titles, that gives an overall outline of what's happening. And then so there's these mixtures over.
Why are the illustrations, though, so menacing?
I wanted them to be.
Oh, you did?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I actually chose and worked with an artist to make sure that they certainly came across that way. Because I think, I think that we haunt ourselves. I mean, I think we're a menace to ourselves, right? There's this concept most people know in Islam called jihad. And most of us think of that as meaning holy war.
Yeah.
But actually the jihad just means struggle. And Prophet Muhammad said that the greatest struggle that we face is the jihad in nafs, or the struggle with ourselves, right? And I think we are menacing to ourselves. Like we are our own worst enemies. I mean, I'll be honest, writing this and putting this out, I was just like, oh, geez, what am I doing? I hope this comes across well. I hope this is seen well. What are people going to think about this? Right? I mean, we all do this to ourselves. So I wanted it to be menacing, but I also wanted there to be a conflict in the book, right? There's just so in one way, you get the cover, it looks all menacing. I mean, the character on the cover is Popobawa.
Oh, it is?
It is.
Oh, okay.
And he's known under folklore to have this really dark nature. But if you understand his story, all of a sudden it seems really understandable, right? And so his story is kind of told, and you understand why he is so menacing. And I think mixing together both, the dark and the menacing with the soft and the floral, I think that's what makes things beautiful sometimes. And I wanted that conflict. It's kind of like food, right? Like chocolate is sweet, but it's also bitter. Right?
Another three-letter word that turns up in the book, more than I expected, was sex.
Does it? Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of passion. There's a lot of sleeping together with sheets and bedding floating above the bed.
Yes.
And there are flirtations that go on. Yeah.
Yeah. You should know that a lot of people in our family are flirts. It's like it runs in the blood.
Are flirts.
We're flirts. My mom will attest to that. She was always keeping an eye on my dad. So,
are you sure you want to be saying this publicly?
It's all in the book. No. But I think, the way I approach it is, I don't think I think sex sounds boring, right? But like connection, I mean, that's steamy, right? And I think it's not about, it's more about the connection. And I think that's what I pull in here. The ability to relate to people, to want, to yearn for somebody. And that's really what I was hoping to get across in this book, is this yearning, right? And I think we yearn for many things. I think we yearn for lovers sometimes, but I think we yearn for mostly company and acknowledgement, right? And wanting to be understood. And I think that's the metaphor that I hope to achieve in that book.
Well, I made mention of your metaphor, or the word sex, because I wanted to help you sell some more books.
Oh, yeah. I'd like to think it's a sex book. I'd like to.
Now, turning to the people here, who you've heard a lot. We've covered a huge amount of territory. The book covers staggering amounts more, but questions from you are important. What do you want to ask Raymond?
Yeah.
You're talking about your shadow self or shadow self. What authors were shadowing you as you were writing?
So I'll just repeat that in case it wasn't heard. So you talk about shadow self. This lovely man is asking, who was shadowing you when you were writing this?
There's a lot of shadow authors for me. I think about Imam al-Ghazali, the ancient scholar who talks about Ihya ulumuddin, like the science of the faith. People don't know this, but I'm a bit of a Jinn nerd. And growing up, I read, and I still, anytime I get an authentic book about the Jinn, I'm like right through it. So all of those authors were with me, including Imam Bilal Phillips. But I love the idea of magical realism, and I think about how the supernatural just fades into the background. I think any good horror story is not about the scary stuff. It's really, the scary stuff is the stuff about humans and what we do to each other. And so I think about Jeanette Winterson and The Passion. I think about Anne Rice. I know it seems like pulp, but
Really? Yeah?
yeah, I love Anne Rice. That was what really pulled me into reading. Actually, was Anne Rice, weirdly enough. And again, it was less. I mean, she made it. I don't know if she did as much magical realism, but there was more to the story than it was just, vampires. There was like these relationships between people, and then there was TV, right? I talked about it in my movie.
In your new book, yeah.
Yeah, movies, miniseries, and multiculturalism. Mike Flanagan, and I think about the metaphors that he pulls into his works. Where, I mean, for him, what I found beautiful about his work is that what's frightening is not the supernatural. It's people and trauma. And so those were all the people behind me, I would say. Yeah.
Just listening to you, I'm reminded of three tales in popular culture, like Water for Chocolate, that one episode of The X-Files,
Yes.
and 3,000 Years of Longing.
Don't get me started on 3,000 Years of Longing.
Did you hate it or like it?
I love it.
I've watched it 5 times now, and I find that, and it really does play into, what you get back into, the more ancient. Or,
Yes.
Because I've spent a lot of time in Islamic scholarship and living in Islamic countries. And,
Yes.
And I love that tie-in with the magical realism.
Yes.
Because that really comes through a lot in Latin American culture as well.
Yes.
As Colombian, like the sense of the fantastic, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to elaborate on those connections or the parts about popular culture that I just mentioned, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, please do.
So, yeah, I love that movie. 3,000 Years of Longing was like, I love this movie.
Eye candy.
Yeah, it is eye candy. What I loved about it is that it went into telling parts of a faith-based story that are not often told. I mean, it was certain veers away from the original tale, but it talks about people. Have you never seen the movie? It talks about King Solomon, or according to Muslims, Prophet Suleiman, who had control over the jinn, and he could speak to them and control them. and he meets the Queen of Sheba, whose name is Bilqis, who in this movie is part Jinn. And so I love that movie. But what I like, well, that was a motivation for me to really finish this book, because I was like, this is somebody who's not from the cultural background, not a Muslim, and is writing about this as the author. And I was like, this would be really good told by, like, we don't have, like, as a culture, we tell Jinn stories all the time, but they don't tend to show up in literature. And I was like, I gotta tell this story from my perspective, right? But talking about magical realism, maybe one of the reasons I love it so much is because it's how we live our lives. You know, like, it's funny, like, we are now watching, you know, and reading about things like Harry Potter, or, you know, like you know, Wednesday Addams, you know, like, this is new to the Western world. It was like, this is old hat for us. You know, like, we live in a quote unquote magical realism world. Like, it is a part of our everyday life. And so to be able to write about it was to give it permission to exist beyond the family. You know, what I talk about in the book is, and there's elements of truth here, is that these stories show up at our dinner tables. And a big part of my work, not just with this book, is to take the conversations that are often had in private and make them public. Because we can't blame people for not, like, I mean, we can blame many people who are marginalized for not talking about their experience because it's not safe. But also then there's many good people who have a lot of privilege and don't have the marginalization and just don't know because they're just not privy to that because of that. And so a lot of my work is about creating spaces of safety where we can have those really quiet conversations publicly, and people are like, I did not know that. And then people learn and they know, and then now we have this overlapping where we share a similar culture. And part of my hope for Jinn and the family was not, like, maybe it's a big dream and maybe it's a silly dream, but I wanted to influence culture. And that's a big part of my work too, is like, I don't want culture to remain white. I want culture to remain colorful and nuanced, where all of us are getting the same metaphors, right? Like, you know, you can watch for an anthology. It's already out. It's available for purchase. So it's called the Poetry of Angry Black and Brown People. The original title was The Poetry of Terrorists and Other Angry Black and Brown People. And there's a cross through on the cover on terrorists. And anybody with that word is like, it's like, for those of us who've lived with that word, it doesn't bother us. And it's meant to flaunt that thing, to say we are not those people. But when we share culture, when we understand things with each other, we disarm each other, and we can actually have the meaningful conversations that want to be had. And so with Jinn, I was like, I wanted to bring this into Western culture, into our diverse, pluralistic culture. Thank you.
Now, we have a stack of books on the table that Raymond is prepared to autograph for you. He'll be autographing the book the way that he did for the King of Hawaii. This is true, right?
Yeah, this is true. Yeah.
Who's the King of Hawaii?
Tribal king of Atui, Kingdom of Atui in Hawaii. I met him at the United Nations. I was the chair for the Committee on International Relations and the American Psych Association several years ago, and part of that meant I had to attend the United Nations on Psychology Day, and which was the main motivation for me to run for that position. I had no interest in that position except for, they said, you get to go to the United Nations. I'm like, I'll run for that position. Yeah. And so when we were there, there he was. And there was like a gathering, and there was speaking on different topics related to mental health. And he was up there talking, and a very interesting, very kind man, you know, full facial tribal tattoos. And the director of the Office of International Affairs goes, that's the King of Hawaii. And I was like, well, I guess I should go say hello then. So I went up and said hello, and he's so friendly. He's like, here's my number, text me sometime. And so him and I have been on a texting basis for some time. And so when I got this book out, I said, do you mind reading it and tell me what you think about it? He wrote a beautiful endorsement for the book. which is not in the book, but it's up on the website. And what I liked about that was, I've said this all the time through my work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that outside of the white and Western world, it doesn't matter what culture we come from, there's a great sense of relatability. We all get it outside of the white and Western world. It doesn't matter where we come from. And he got it. And he's like, this is exactly what we've been trying to say. Wow. These are the things that nobody lets us talk about. There it is. So that was nice. That was an honor.
Mm-hmm. Well, Raymond, I hate to say that our time has come to an end. I think there's a lot of interest and people aren't leaving and they're dying to buy your books. So what should we do going forward?
Isn't this event?
Yes.
Yeah. You know what? Please stick around. There's some bookmarks in the back. Please help yourself to some of those. There's some masks. Take some home. Take some for your kids. And there's some cookies. Please help yourself to some of those. For those of you who want to stick around, like I'll be there signing some books if you want a book signed, and if you want to have some conversations, I'm happy to do that too.
And as far as you know, are there any Jinn in the room now?
I mean, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Raymond, see you soon, okay?
Thank you very much.
Take good care.